The morning mist hung over London like a gentle embrace as Catherine stood at the window of Kensington Palace, watching the city slowly wake up. Her reflection stared back at her, showing a woman who had grown into her role as the Princess of Wales with grace and determination. Today was different from any other day in her royal calendar. Today marked the beginning of something that had become deeply personal to her, the fifth annual Together at Christmas service at Westminster Abbey. She traced her finger along the cool glass, remembering how this tradition had started 5 years ago. It began as a simple idea during one of the most challenging periods in recent royal history. The world was still recovering from the pandemic, families were separated, and communities were struggling to find hope. Catherine had approached the Archbishop of Canterbury with a vision that seemed almost too ambitious to create a Christmas service that would bring together people from all walks of life, celebrating those who had shown extraordinary kindness and service to others. The skeptics had been numerous. Royal protocol officers worried about security. Palace advisors questioned whether such an inclusive event would resonate with the traditional monarchy supporters. Media critics wondered if Catherine was overstepping her boundaries, trying to create something too modern, too different from centuries of royal Christmas traditions. But Catherine had pressed forward, driven by something deeper than duty or protocol. As she moved away from the window, Catherine's mind drifted to her childhood Christmases in Berkshire. Her mother Carol had always made Christmas magical, not through expensive gifts or elaborate decorations, but through the warmth of bringing people together. The Middleton family home was always open to neighbors who had nowhere to go, to elderly relatives who lived alone, to anyone who needed a place at the table. Those memories had shaped Catherine's understanding of what Christmas truly meant. It was about connection, compassion, and community. Her personal assistant knocked gently on the door, bringing the morning briefing. The schedule for today was packed with final preparations for tomorrow's service. Catherine would visit the Abbey to oversee the last-minute arrangements, meet with the choir for their final rehearsal, and personally greet some of the guests who had traveled from across the Commonwealth to attend. But first, she had requested a private moment at the Abbey, alone with her thoughts and prayers. The drive through London revealed a city preparing for Christmas. Shop windows glowed with warm lights, families walked hand in hand down the decorated streets, and there was that unmistakable feeling of anticipation in the air. Catherine loved this time of year, but she also felt the weight of responsibility. Tomorrow's service wasn't just another royal engagement, it had become a beacon of hope for millions of people around the world who watched and drew inspiration from the stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Westminster Abbey came into view, its ancient spires reaching toward the grey December sky. Catherine had walked through these doors countless times, for her wedding to William, for state occasions, for moments of national celebration and mourning. But this place held a special significance for her Christmas service. The Abbey had witnessed over 1,000 years of British history, had been the setting for coronations and royal weddings, had provided sanctuary during times of war and celebration during times of peace. It was the perfect backdrop for a service that honored both tradition and innovation. Inside the Abbey, the transformation was remarkable. Gone were the traditional formal arrangements of red and gold. Instead, the ancient walls were adorned with thousands of twinkling lights, creating an atmosphere that felt both sacred and intimate. The Christmas trees, each one carefully selected, stood tall throughout the nave, decorated not with expensive ornaments but with handwritten messages from children in care homes, from military families separated during deployment, from communities that had faced hardship together. Catherine walked slowly down the aisle, her heels echoing softly against the stone floor. She paused at each installation, reading some of the messages that had been sent from around the world. A drawing from a 7-year-old in Wales whose father had died serving as a firefighter. A poem from an elderly woman in Scotland who had spent the pandemic delivering groceries to her neighbors. A photograph from a community in Australia that had rebuilt their town after devastating floods, showing dozens of volunteers working side by side. The organist was practicing softly in the background, the haunting melodies of traditional carols mixing with contemporary arrangements that had been specially commissioned for the service. Catherine had insisted on including music that would speak to people of all ages and backgrounds. There would be ancient Latin hymns that connected them to centuries of Christian tradition, but also gospel songs that celebrated joy and resilience, and contemporary pieces that addressed modern challenges while maintaining hope for the future. Mrs. Patterson, the Abbey's head verger, approached with a warm smile. She had worked at Westminster Abbey for over 30 years and had become one of Catherine's most trusted allies in making the Christmas service a reality. Together, they had navigated countless logistical challenges, from accommodating wheelchair access in a building that was nearly a millennium old, to ensuring that the service would be meaningful to people of different faiths and backgrounds. "Your Royal Highness, the final guest list has been confirmed," Mrs. Patterson said, holding a tablet with meticulous care. "We have representatives from 47 different charitable organizations, families from all 4 nations of the United Kingdom, and delegates from 12 Commonwealth countries. The youngest guest is 5 years old, and the oldest is 93. Catherine smiled, feeling a familiar flutter of excitement mixed with nervousness. Each year, the guest list for Together at Christmas was carefully curated, but not in the traditional sense of inviting dignitaries and celebrities. Instead, Catherine and her team spent months identifying ordinary people who had done extraordinary things. Teachers who had gone above and beyond for their students. Healthcare workers who had shown exceptional compassion. Volunteers who had dedicated their lives to helping others. Community leaders who had brought hope to struggling neighborhoods. The selection process was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Every nomination came with a story that could bring tears to your eyes and restore your faith in humanity simultaneously. Catherine personally read every submission, often staying up late into the night, learning about people whose names would never appear in newspaper headlines but whose actions had changed lives and communities. This year's service held special significance because it marked a milestone: 5 years of bringing together these unsung heroes. Over those 5 years, the event had grown from a small, experimental service to something that was broadcast around the world, inspiring similar initiatives in other countries and communities. But Catherine was determined that growth wouldn't compromise the intimate, personal nature of what made Together at Christmas special. She moved to the front of the Abbey, where tomorrow she would deliver a message that she had been crafting for weeks. Unlike formal royal speeches, this message needed to come from her heart. It needed to acknowledge the challenges that so many people faced while celebrating the incredible capacity for human kindness that existed even in the darkest times. The afternoon brought a series of meetings with various teams responsible for different aspects of tomorrow's service. The security briefing revealed the complexity of hosting an event that was both public and intimate, formal and accessible. The media coordination required balancing the desire to share these inspiring stories with the world while protecting the privacy and dignity of the guests who had never asked for public attention. Catherine found herself thinking about her own children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, and what lessons she hoped they would learn from events like this. She wanted them to understand that true privilege came not from titles or wealth, but from the opportunity to serve others. She hoped they would grow up understanding that their royal positions gave them a platform to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. The final meeting of the day was perhaps the most important, a gathering with some of the guests who had arrived in London early. Catherine always insisted on personally meeting as many attendees as possible before the service. Not for photographs or formal presentations, but for genuine conversations about their lives, their work, and their experiences. In the chapter house, she met Sarah, a single mother from Liverpool who had started a food bank in her garage after losing her job during the pandemic. The food bank had grown to serve over 200 families, operating entirely on donations and volunteer work. Sarah's hands were rough from years of manual labor, but her eyes shone with pride as she talked about the community that had formed around her simple act of wanting to help her neighbors. Next, Catherine spoke with David, a retired teacher from Cardiff who had begun tutoring refugee children for free after noticing how many were struggling with language barriers in school. What started as helping one family had grown into a network of volunteer tutors working with over 50 children. David's Welsh accent was thick with emotion as he described watching these children gain confidence not just in English, but in themselves. The conversations continued late into the afternoon. Catherine met with Marcus, a teenager from Birmingham who had started a mental health support group for young men after losing his best friend to suicide. She spoke with Elena, an elderly woman from Edinburgh who had transformed her neighborhood by organizing community gardens in empty lots, bringing together people from different cultures and backgrounds to grow food and friendships together. Each story reminded Catherine why this service mattered. These weren't celebrity philanthropists with million-dollar foundations. These were ordinary people who had looked around their communities, seen problems or pain, and decided to do something about it. They hadn't waited for government programs or charity organizations to take action. They had simply started where they were, with what they had, and made a difference. As evening fell over London, Catherine returned to Kensington Palace with her heart full but her mind busy with final preparations. Tomorrow's service would begin with the lighting of candles representing hope in darkness, continue with readings and music that celebrated human resilience and compassion, and conclude with a moment of silent reflection followed by the ringing of the Abbey's bells. But, tonight, Catherine sat in her private study, writing personal notes to each of the guests who would attend tomorrow. Not formal thank you letters, but heartfelt messages acknowledging what their service meant to their communities and to her personally. She wrote about how their examples inspired her own approach to royal duty, how their stories would be shared with her children as examples of true leadership and character. The palace was quiet except for the soft scratching of her pen against paper. Outside, London continued its Christmas preparations, unaware that tomorrow would bring a service that had quietly become one of the most meaningful traditions in the modern royal calendar. Catherine looked up from her writing, glancing at a framed photograph of her family, and felt grateful for the privilege of honoring people whose greatest reward was simply knowing they had helped others. Tomorrow, Westminster Abbey would once again witness history, not the crowning of kings or the celebration of military victories, but the recognition of the quiet heroes who made the world a better place one act of kindness at a time. And Catherine, the woman who had started this tradition with little more than hope and determination, would stand before them all, representing not just the crown, but the very best of human nature that they embodied every day. The morning of the 5th annual Together at Christmas service dawned crisp and clear, with winter's sunlight streaming through the tall windows of Westminster Abbey. Catherine arrived earlier than scheduled, wanting to experience the sacred space in its quiet moments before it filled with the voices and energy of hundreds of guests. The Abbey felt different today, charged with anticipation and purpose. She moved through the ancient corridors with familiar ease, greeting the staff members who had become like family over the years of organizing this service. Each person, from the flower arrangers to the sound technicians, understood that today was about more than royal protocol or religious ceremony. It was about creating a space where ordinary heroes could feel extraordinary, where stories of kindness could echo through halls that had witnessed centuries of British history. In the vestry, Catherine met with Archbishop Justin Welby, who had become not just an official partner in this annual tradition, but a personal friend and spiritual advisor. His understanding of both ancient church traditions and contemporary social challenges had helped shape the service into something that honored the past while speaking powerfully to present-day concerns. Each year, I'm amazed by the caliber of people you and your team identify, the Archbishop said as they reviewed the final order of service. These aren't people seeking recognition or reward. They're simply living out the gospel message of love and service in the most practical, beautiful ways. Catherine nodded, thinking about the months of preparation that had led to this day. The nomination process had become increasingly competitive, not in a negative way, but because word had spread about the service's significance. Communities across the United Kingdom and Commonwealth had begun actively identifying and nominating their local heroes, creating a network of recognition that extended far beyond the annual service itself. The selection committee, which Catherine personally chaired, met monthly throughout the year to review nominations. Each meeting was both heartbreaking and inspiring as they read story after story of resilience, compassion, and quiet heroism. Teachers who had mortgaged their homes to buy supplies for students from low-income families. Healthcare workers who had worked double shifts during the pandemic while caring for their own sick relatives. Community organizers who had brought together divided neighborhoods through shared projects and mutual aid. This year's service included several particularly moving stories that had captured Catherine's attention. There was Amara, a refugee from South Sudan who had arrived in Manchester with nothing but had built a successful catering business that employed other refugee women while providing traditional African cuisine to food banks and community centers. Her journey from displacement to entrepreneurship, always with a focus on lifting others as she climbed, embodied the resilience and generosity that the service celebrated. Then, there was Tom and Jennifer, a couple from rural Yorkshire who had lost their teenage son in a car accident and had channeled their grief into creating a mobile library that brought books and literacy programs to isolated farming communities. Their converted van had become a lifeline for families whose children had limited access to educational resources, transforming personal tragedy into community healing. Catherine was particularly moved by the story of 15-year-old Priya from Leicester, who had organized a citywide campaign to provide period products to homeless women after learning that many avoided shelters during menstruation due to lack of basic sanitary supplies. Priya's initiative had not only addressed a practical need but had also broken down barriers of shame and stigma, creating conversations about dignity and support that extended far beyond her original goal. As guests began arriving at the Abbey, Catherine positioned herself near the entrance to personally greet as many as possible. This was always her favorite part of the day, seeing these remarkable people step into one of Britain's most prestigious venues, often for the first time, and watching their faces light up with wonder and pride. Sarah from Liverpool arrived with her teenage daughter, both wearing dresses they had clearly bought specially for the occasion. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she shook Catherine's hand, still hardly believing that her garage-turned food bank had led to this moment. Her daughter whispered, "Mom, you really are a hero," and Catherine felt her heart swell watching this woman realize that others saw her as she truly was extraordinary. The Abbey filled gradually with an unusually diverse crowd. Unlike typical royal events dominated by dignitaries and formal protocol, today's gathering included children in wheelchairs, elderly volunteers using walking aids, young activists with bright hair and tattoos, military veterans, religious leaders from multiple faiths, and families representing dozens of different ethnic and cultural backgrounds. William arrived with their children, who had insisted on attending this year's service. George, Charlotte, and Louis had grown up hearing stories from previous year's services and wanted to meet some of the heroes their mother talked about with such admiration. Catherine had worried about including them, not wanting the focus to shift from the honored guests to the royal family, but she realized that showing her children these examples of service was one of the most important lessons she could teach them. The service began with the lighting of candles, each flame representing hope in darkness. Catherine had written this opening ritual to acknowledge that many of the guests had found their calling to serve others during their own difficult times. The symbolism was intentional: light emerging from darkness, hope rising from despair, community forming around shared challenges. As the candles were lit, the Abbey choir began singing "This Little Light of Mine," but in an arrangement that wove together voices from different musical traditions. The ancient Gothic arches carried voices singing in Welsh, Scottish Gaelic, Hindi, Arabic, and a dozen other languages, creating a tapestry of sound that represented the diversity of the United Kingdom and Commonwealth in the 21st century. The first reading came from Marcus, the teenager from Birmingham who had started the mental health support group. His voice cracked slightly as he read from 1 Corinthians 13 about love being patient and kind, but his words carried across the Abbey with power and authenticity. Catherine watched as other young people in the congregation sat up straighter, seeing themselves reflected in this brave young man who had turned his pain into purpose. Between readings and musical selections, Catherine took the opportunity to share brief stories about some of the honored guests, but she was careful to speak about them rather than for them. This was their day, their moment to be recognized, and she saw her role as simply helping others understand the magnitude of their contributions. She spoke about Elena from Edinburgh, whose community gardens had not only provided fresh food in neighborhoods classified as food deserts but had also created spaces where recent immigrants could share agricultural knowledge from their home countries while learning about Scottish growing seasons. The gardens had become informal integration centers, places where language barriers dissolved over shared work and mutual learning. Catherine's voice filled with emotion as she described the ripple effects of these individual acts of service. Elena's gardens had inspired similar projects in 6 other Scottish cities. Sarah's food bank model had been replicated in over 30 communities across England. David's tutoring network had grown to include over 200 volunteer tutors working with refugee and immigrant families throughout Wales. The children's choir from a primary school in Tower Hamlets performed a song they had written themselves about kindness, their young voices blending together in harmonies that seemed to make the ancient stones of the Abbey vibrate with joy. Many of the guests wiped away tears, not just at the beauty of the performance, but at the recognition that their work was helping to shape the next generation's understanding of community and care. During the sermon, Archbishop Welby spoke about the theological concept of bearing fruit, drawing connections between the gospel message of service and the lived experiences of the day's honored guests. He didn't preach abstract doctrine but instead spoke practically about how faith, whether Christian or otherwise, called people to look beyond themselves and work for the common good. The people we celebrate today haven't just talked about love and service, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the Abbey's sound system. They have embodied these values in ways that have transformed communities and touched countless lives. They remind us that the most profound faith is often expressed not in words but in actions, not in grand gestures but in daily choices to put others' needs alongside our own. Catherine had requested that the service include a moment for silent reflection, a chance for everyone present to think about their own opportunities to serve. As hundreds of people sat in quiet contemplation within the sacred walls of Westminster Abbey, the only sounds were the distant hum of London traffic and the occasional creak of ancient wood settling in the winter air. During this silence, Catherine found herself thinking about the evolution of her own understanding of royal duty. When she had married William, she had expected to fulfill traditional roles, cutting ribbons, attending galas, representing the crown at formal events. But the pandemic had shown her that true leadership meant getting closer to people's real struggles and finding ways to amplify solutions that were already working in communities. The Together at Christmas service had become a model for a different kind of royal engagement, one that celebrated existing heroes rather than creating photo opportunities, one that highlighted systemic solutions rather than individual charity, one that brought diverse communities together rather than maintaining traditional hierarchies. As the reflection time ended, the congregation joined together in singing In the Bleak Midwinter, but the arrangement included verses in different languages and musical styles that reflected the cultural diversity of modern Britain. The final verse, sung in harmony by the entire Abbey, created a sound so powerful that several guests later said they felt the building itself was singing. The service concluded with Catherine's personal message, words she had crafted carefully to honor the guests while challenging others to follow their example. She spoke about the privilege of witnessing so much goodness, about the responsibility that came with platforms and resources, and about her hope that the stories shared today would inspire others to look for ways to serve in their own communities. You have shown us that heroism doesn't require superpowers or special training, Catherine said, her voice carrying across the packed Abbey. It simply requires the courage to see a need and the commitment to respond. You have taught us that the most profound changes often begin with the smallest actions, taken consistently, with love and determination. As the bells of Westminster Abbey rang out across London, marking the end of the 5th annual Together at Christmas service, guests slowly began to make their way to the reception in the Abbey's chapter house. But many lingered in the nave, reluctant to leave this space where they had felt so seen, so valued, so celebrated for simply being who they were and doing what they felt called to do. Catherine moved through the crowd, no longer following royal protocol but simply connecting human to human with these remarkable people who had reminded her once again why real service, was the highest calling anyone could answer. The reception following the 5th annual Together at Christmas service transformed Westminster Abbey's chapter house into a space that buzzed with conversations unlike any typical royal gathering. Catherine moved through the crowd, but this time without the formal receiving line protocol that usually governs such events. Instead, she found herself drawn into genuine discussions with guests who were eager to share not just their own stories, but their curiosity about each other's work. Near the medieval stone arches, she discovered an animated conversation between Amara, the South Sudanese refugee who had built her catering business, and Tom from Yorkshire, whose mobile library served rural communities. They were discussing the challenges of reaching isolated populations, with Amara sharing how she had adapted traditional recipes to work with locally available ingredients, while Tom explained how he had learned to navigate narrow country roads with his converted library van. The beautiful thing is how similar our challenges are, even though our work is so different, Amara was saying to a small group that had gathered around them. We're all trying to reach people who have been overlooked, trying to bring something essential to places where it's missing. Catherine paused to listen, struck by how naturally these conversations were developing. This was exactly what she had hoped for when she first conceived the service, not just recognition for individual achievements, but connections between people doing similar work in different contexts, creating networks of support and shared learning. Across the room, she spotted 15-year-old Priya deep in conversation with several adult community organizers, her confidence evident as she explained her approach to advocacy and social change. The teenager was surrounded by people 3 times her age, all listening intently as she described how she had used social media to build awareness about period poverty while also working with local government officials to implement policy changes. The trick is meeting people where they are, Priya was explaining. You can't shame people into caring about an issue. You have to help them understand why it matters to them, to people they know and care about. Catherine felt a surge of pride watching this young woman hold her own among experienced activists and community leaders. Priya represented something important about this generation: their refusal to wait until adulthood to tackle serious social issues, their intuitive understanding of how to blend digital organizing with grassroots community work. The afternoon had been carefully structured to allow maximum time for these organic interactions. Rather than formal presentations or speeches, Catherine had arranged for several conversation areas where guests could share their experiences and learn from each other. Professional facilitators, themselves community organizers and social workers, helped guide discussions that ranged from practical challenges like funding and volunteer recruitment to deeper questions about sustaining hope in the face of overwhelming need. In one corner, a group of healthcare workers were comparing notes about maintaining mental health while caring for others during times of crisis. Dr. Sarah Chen, a pediatric nurse who had organized mental health support for healthcare workers during the pandemic, was sharing strategies she had learned for preventing burnout while maintaining compassion. We learned that taking care of ourselves isn't selfish, Dr. Chen explained to the group. It's actually essential for being able to take care of others. You can't pour from an empty cup, as the saying goes. This conversation was particularly meaningful to Catherine, who had struggled with her own understanding of self-care versus duty throughout her years as a royal. The pandemic had forced many people, including herself, to reconsider traditional notions of service and sacrifice, recognizing that sustainable service required sustainable caregivers. As the afternoon progressed, Catherine found herself in a quieter conversation with Elena from Edinburgh, the elderly woman whose community gardens had transformed neglected urban spaces into thriving neighborhood centers. Elena's weathered hands gestured expressively as she described not just the practical aspects of urban gardening, but the deeper social changes that had emerged from bringing people together around shared work. At first, I thought we were just growing vegetables, Elena said with a slight Scottish accent that became more pronounced as she grew excited. But what we were really growing was community. People who had lived next to each other for years without speaking became friends. Children learned where food comes from. Elderly people found purpose and connection. It was never really about the tomatoes. Catherine nodded, understanding exactly what Elena meant. The Together at Christmas service itself had evolved similarly, growing from a simple idea about recognition into something much larger about community building and social change. The annual service had become a catalyst for year-round networking and collaboration among community organizations throughout the United Kingdom and Commonwealth. William appeared at her side, having spent the afternoon in his own conversations with guests. Their children had been particularly drawn to Marcus, the teenager who had started the mental health support group, and to several of the younger guests whose work focused on issues affecting young people. Charlotte asked me if she could start a project like Marcus's at her school, William said quietly to Catherine. She wants to know if talking about feelings and mental health could help other children feel less alone. Catherine felt her heart swell with pride and concern simultaneously. She wanted her children to develop empathy and a sense of service, but she also worried about the pressures they faced as royal children, the scrutiny that followed their every action. The balance between protecting their privacy and teaching them about public service was something she navigated carefully every day. What did you tell her? Catherine asked. That we would talk about it as a family, maybe find ways for her to get involved with existing programs rather than starting something new, William replied. Marcus actually suggested she might visit some of the schools where his group operates, just to listen and learn before thinking about her own contributions. This exchange highlighted one of the unexpected outcomes of the Together at Christmas service: its impact on the royal family's own understanding of their roles and responsibilities. Exposure to these grassroots heroes had influenced how Catherine and William approached their official duties, leading them to seek out and support existing initiatives rather than always creating new programs or charities. As the reception continued, Catherine noticed several guests exchanging contact information, making plans to visit each other's projects, discussing potential collaborations. David, the Welsh tutor working with refugee families, was deep in conversation with several guests whose work focused on immigrant integration, sharing resources and strategies that could benefit all their programs. Mrs. Patterson approached Catherine with a tablet showing social media posts that were already emerging from the service. Unlike the typically formal coverage of royal events, these posts captured genuine moments of connection and inspiration. Guests were sharing photos not of themselves with Catherine, but of themselves with each other, celebrating the new friendships and professional connections they were making. One post that particularly caught Catherine's attention came from Sarah, the food bank organizer from Liverpool. "Today I met people doing incredible work I'd never heard of. Already planning visits to learn from their approaches. This isn't just recognition, it's revolution." That word revolution resonated with Catherine. Not revolution in the sense of overthrowing systems, but revolution in the sense of transforming how society recognized, supported, and replicated grassroots solutions to social problems. The Together at Christmas service was becoming something larger than an annual event, it was becoming a movement. As the formal reception wound down, Catherine had arranged for one final element that had become tradition: small group discussions where guests could share what they hoped to take away from the experience and how they planned to apply what they had learned. These conversations were private, not recorded or broadcast, giving people space to be vulnerable about their challenges and hopes. Catherine joined one of these groups, sitting in a circle with 8 guests representing different types of community work. The conversation was led by Dr. James Mitchell, a community psychologist who specialized in trauma-informed care and had been working with communities affected by violence and poverty for over 20 years. "What I've learned today," said Jennifer, Tom's wife from the Mobile Library Project, "is that grief can be a teacher, not just a burden. Meeting other people who have turned their pain into purpose has shown me that our son's death doesn't have to be meaningless. The work we do in his memory creates meaning." Her words hung in the air, creating space for others to share their own vulnerabilities and insights. Catherine found herself thinking about her own relationship with public scrutiny and criticism, how she had learned to transform the pressure and judgment into motivation for more authentic, meaningful work. Marcus, the teenager, spoke next. "I always thought I was too young for people to take me seriously. But seeing other young people here, and how the adults listen to us and learn from us, makes me realize that age doesn't determine the value of your ideas or your ability to create change." Dr. Chen, the healthcare worker, added, "The isolation of the pandemic made me forget that there are people everywhere doing this kind of work. Today reminded me that I'm not alone, that there's a whole community of people who understand the calling to serve others, even when it's difficult." As Catherine listened to these reflections, she realized that the service had evolved beyond her original vision. She had initially imagined it as a way to shine light on unsung heroes, to give them recognition they deserved. But what had emerged was something more complex and powerful: a community of practice, a network of mutual support, a model for how recognition could become transformation. The late afternoon sun streamed through the chapter house's ancient windows, casting long shadows across the stone floor where medieval monks had once gathered for their own community meetings. Catherine felt the weight of history in this moment, understanding that they were creating their own tradition that future generations might look back on as a turning point in how society valued and supported grassroots service. As guests began to leave, many stopping to thank Catherine but also to thank each other, she reflected on how much her own understanding of leadership had evolved through these 5 years of Together at Christmas services. Leadership, she had learned, wasn't about being the most important person in the room or having the final word on decisions. Leadership was about creating spaces where other people's gifts could flourish, where connections could form, where solutions could emerge from the wisdom of communities rather than from the top down. The final guest to leave was Elena, the gardener from Edinburgh. She approached Catherine with a small pot containing a cutting from one of her community garden plants, a hardy Scottish rose that could survive harsh winters and bloom again each spring. "For your garden at Kensington," Elena said with a smile. "Something to remember that the most beautiful things often grow from the most difficult conditions." Catherine accepted the gift, understanding its deeper symbolism. The Together at Christmas service had become her own garden, a place where she had learned that true royal service meant cultivating conditions for others to thrive, not just showcasing her own good works. As she held the small plant, she was already thinking about next year's service and the new stories of courage and compassion that would emerge from communities across the United Kingdom and beyond. 3 months after the 5th annual Together at Christmas service, Catherine found herself in places she never could have imagined when she first conceived the idea. The ripple effects of that December day at Westminster Abbey had spread far beyond what any of them had anticipated, creating a movement that was reshaping how communities across the United Kingdom and Commonwealth approached social change and mutual support. She was currently standing in a converted warehouse in Manchester, watching Amara train a group of refugee women in commercial food preparation techniques. The space buzzed with activity as women from Somalia, Syria, Afghanistan, and South Sudan worked alongside each other, sharing cooking methods while learning British food safety regulations and business management skills. The aroma of spices from around the world filled the air, creating an atmosphere that was both practical and deeply nurturing. The waiting list for our training program is now 6 months long, Amara explained to Catherine as they watched a woman from Eritrea teach another from Bangladesh how to prepare injera bread. But it's not just about the cooking skills. These women are building friendships, support networks. They're learning English through recipes, understanding British culture through food. This expansion had been one of the most direct results of the Christmas service. Several guests who attended had approached Amara about replicating her model in their own cities. With support from local councils and a small grant that Catherine had helped connect them with, similar programs were now operating in Birmingham, Leeds, and Glasgow. But, perhaps more importantly, the women in these programs were beginning to see themselves differently. Catherine spoke with Fatima, a mother of 3 who had arrived from Syria 2 years earlier and was now one of Amara's assistant trainers. Before this program, I felt like I was always taking benefits, help from charities, assistance with English classes, Fatima said in carefully chosen words, her accent still thick but her confidence evident. Now I give back. I teach. I help other women learn. I am not just refugee anymore. I am teacher, I am business owner. This transformation from recipient to contributor was something Catherine had witnessed repeatedly in the months following the service. The recognition and networking that happened that day had catalyzed changes that went far beyond the individual honorees, creating conditions for broader community transformation. From Manchester, Catherine traveled to Yorkshire to visit Tom and Jennifer's mobile library program, which had evolved dramatically since the Christmas service. Their single converted van had inspired a network of mobile services that now included not just books and literacy programs, but also mobile mental health support, traveling job training workshops, and even a mobile veterinary service for isolated farming communities. The transformation had been sparked by conversations at the Abbey reception, where rural community organizers from Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland had compared challenges and solutions. They had realized that isolation was a common threat across all their communities, and that mobile services could address multiple needs simultaneously. Catherine arrived at a small village outside Harrogate where Tom was conducting a literacy workshop for elderly residents who had never learned to read properly. In the same parking area, a mental health counselor was meeting with farmers struggling with depression and anxiety, while a veterinarian examined livestock for families who couldn't afford to transport animals to distant clinics. What we learned from your Christmas service, Tom explained as they watched an 80-year-old grandmother slowly sound out words with the help of a volunteer tutor, was that problems are connected, so solutions should be connected too. Literacy, mental health, economic struggles, social isolation, they're all part of the same web. Jennifer added, and when people told us how our work had inspired them, we realized we had a responsibility to think bigger, to help other communities adapt what we'd learned to their specific needs. The mobile library van had been decorated with photos from the Christmas service, showing Tom and Jennifer with other honorees. But, more than decoration, these images served as daily reminders of the larger community of service they were now part of. Catherine noticed that several other guests' contact information was pinned to a bulletin board inside the van, evidence of ongoing collaboration and mutual support. Catherine's next stop was Edinburgh, where Elena's community gardens had become the centerpiece of what local officials were calling an urban resilience initiative. The original gardens had expanded to include tool libraries, community composting programs, and skill-sharing workshops that brought together longtime residents with recent immigrants, elderly people with young families, unemployed individuals with professionals seeking meaningful volunteer opportunities. Elena, now 78 but moving with the energy of someone decades younger, guided Catherine through gardens that had transformed not just physical spaces but social relationships throughout the neighborhood. Children who had participated in the gardening programs were now teaching younger children. Teenagers had created art installations using recycled materials. Adults were leading workshops on everything from preserving food to repairing bicycles. The soil taught us something important, Elena said as they paused beside a thriving patch of winter vegetables. You can't grow anything in isolation. Plants need each other, they share nutrients through their root systems, they protect each other from pests and weather. Communities are the same way. The success of Elena's model had attracted attention from urban planners and social policy researchers, but Elena remained focused on the daily work of community building. Catherine noticed that she had created a special section of the garden dedicated to dignity growing plots where people experiencing homelessness or food insecurity could grow their own produce, maintaining a sense of agency and self-respect while meeting practical needs. What moved Catherine most was seeing how Elena had incorporated lessons learned from other Christmas service guests into her own work. She had adapted Priya's advocacy methods to campaign for policy changes that would make community gardens easier to establish. She had borrowed ideas from David's tutoring program to create informal educational opportunities within the garden space. The final visit of Catherine's follow-up tour took her to Leicester, where 15-year-old Priya's period poverty campaign had evolved into something much larger. Working with several adult allies she had met at the Christmas service, Priya had helped establish a youth advocacy network that tackled multiple issues affecting young people, from mental health support in schools to climate change education to digital literacy for elderly community members. Catherine met with Priya and her team in a community center that had been transformed into a hub for youth-led social change initiatives. The walls were covered with infographics about various social issues, but also with photos from the Christmas service and updates on projects inspired by connections made that day. Meeting all those adults who took young people seriously changed everything for me, Priya explained as she showed Catherine a presentation about their latest campaign addressing public transportation accessibility. I realized that age-based discrimination is just another barrier to overcome, like any other form of prejudice. The youth network had become a model that was being replicated in cities across the United Kingdom. Young people were partnering with adults not as junior assistants but as equal collaborators, bringing different perspectives and skills to shared challenges. Catherine watched teenagers leading planning meetings, managing budgets, and presenting to local government officials with competence that challenged every stereotype about youth capabilities. But perhaps the most profound change Catherine witnessed was in the young people themselves. They moved through the world with a confidence that came from knowing their voices mattered, their ideas had value, their contributions could create real change. This was exactly the kind of transformation she hoped to see in her own children as they grew up understanding their own capacity for service. As her tour concluded, Catherine reflected on how much her own understanding of royal duty had evolved through these 5 years of together at Christmas services. When she had married William, she had expected to support existing charities, attend fundraising events, and lend her presence to causes that others had identified as important. Instead, she had discovered that her most meaningful contribution was creating platforms for others' work, facilitating connections between grassroots organizations, and using her position to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. The Christmas service had become a model for a different kind of royal engagement, one that recognized wisdom and leadership existing throughout communities rather than flowing down from traditional institutions. Back at Kensington Palace, Catherine stood in her private study surrounded by thank you notes, project updates, and collaboration proposals that had resulted from the most recent service. The pile of correspondence was overwhelming in the best possible way, representing hundreds of new initiatives, partnerships, and expansions of existing work. On her desk sat Elena's potted rose cutting, now thriving in a larger pot and beginning to show signs of new growth. Beside it was a framed photograph from the reception following the service, showing not Catherine at the center but rather a group of guests deep in conversation, planning collaborations that would extend far beyond that single day. She picked up her phone to call William, who was visiting a youth mentorship program in Wales that had been inspired by connections made at previous Christmas services. Their children were with him, beginning to understand that royal duty meant supporting other people's solutions rather than always being the center of attention. "How are the follow-up visits going?" William asked when he answered. Beyond anything I could have imagined, Catherine replied, looking out the window at London's skyline. I keep thinking about what Elena said, that communities are like root systems, sharing nutrients and protection. The Christmas service has become a root system for social change. The children are asking if they can attend the planning meetings for next year's service, William said with a laugh. Charlotte has very specific ideas about how to make sure young people feel welcome, and George wants to understand how the guest selection process works. Catherine smiled, feeling hopeful about the next generation's understanding of service and leadership. Her children were growing up seeing royal duty not as ceremonial obligation but as active partnership with communities working for positive change. As she ended the call and returned to her correspondence, Catherine began drafting a letter to the Archbishop about expanding the Christmas service to include regional celebrations throughout the year, creating more opportunities for recognition and networking among grassroots heroes. The single annual service had proven that demand existed for this kind of community celebration, but it had also revealed that once-a-year recognition wasn't sufficient for the scale of remarkable work happening in communities across the United Kingdom and Commonwealth. Outside her window, London continued its daily rhythm of millions of people navigating individual challenges while contributing to collective life. But now Catherine saw that rhythm differently, understanding that heroes like those honored at the Christmas service were woven throughout the city's fabric, quietly making the world better through countless small acts of courage and compassion. The Together at Christmas service had begun as Catherine's idea for recognizing unsung heroes, but it had evolved into something much larger, a recognition that heroism wasn't rare or exceptional but rather a daily choice available to anyone willing to look beyond themselves and work for the common good. And, in creating space to celebrate that truth, Catherine had discovered her own most authentic form of royal service, not leading from above but participating in the community of care that made society possible. As evenings settled over London and Catherine prepared for dinner with her family, she felt grateful for the journey that had led her from wanting to help people to understanding that her role was to help people help each other. The 5th annual Together at Christmas service was already becoming the foundation for the 6th, 7th, and beyond, each one building on the connections and collaborations that transformed individual recognition into collective movement toward a more compassionate world.